In the autumn of 1975, a phone rang in a New York apartment. Babe Paley was on the line, and her voice wasn't right. "Have you seen Esquire?" Nancy Slim. Keith hadn't. She would within the hour, and by the time she finished reading, a friendship that had survived 3 marriages, 1 suicide, and 20 years of secrets would be over for good. The man who destroyed it wasn't a husband. It was her closest friend, a small, sharp-tongued writer named Truman Capote, who had spent 2 decades collecting her confidences the way other people collect stamps, and who had just sold every one of them to a magazine. We'll get to that betrayal. We'll get to why it happened, who died because of it, and what Slim did the moment she closed that magazine. But first you need to understand who this woman actually was, because by the time Capote came for her, Slim Keith had already survived 3 marriages that would have broken most people twice over. She was born Mary Ray Gross in Salinas, California, in 1917, to a family with money, but no particular polish. Her mother renamed her Nancy almost as an afterthought. Nobody called her that. By the time she was a teenager, everyone who met her called her Slim, for the obvious reason, and the nickname followed her for 70 years, through 3 last names and 1 title. Lady Keith of Castleacre died with the same nickname she picked up as a gawky California kid who was too tall and too tan for the girls' magazines of the era. She hated school. She loved horses, tennis, and being outdoors, and she had the kind of unfussy, athletic beauty that didn't photograph like the other starlets of the period. It photographed better. By 22, she was on the cover of Harper's Bazaar. Not because she was trying to be famous. She wasn't an actress and never wanted to be one. She simply had a look that made photographers stop what they were doing, and in the world she was about to marry into, that look would turn out to be a form of currency more durable than any studio contract. She even flirted, briefly, with the idea of training as an opera singer. She had the ear for it and, by most accounts, a decent voice. She dropped the idea almost as quickly as she'd picked it up, deciding the discipline it demanded wasn't worth the trade. That detail matters more than it looks like it should, because it shows up again and again across her life. Slim tried things. If they didn't fit, she walked away from them without much ceremony and moved on to the next thing. Husbands would eventually get the same treatment, though not always by her choice. Here is the first thing people get wrong about Slim Keith. They assume she was a starlet who married up. She wasn't. She never auditioned for a single film. She was something rarer in 1930s Hollywood. A woman who was invited everywhere, courted by everyone, and owned by no studio. Clark Gable pursued her. So did Ernest Hemingway, long before she knew him as a friend. Gary Cooper and Cary Grant were dinner companions, not conquests. She moved through the highest tier of that world entirely on her own terms, at a moment when almost no other woman her age was allowed to. Then, in 1938, she met a director, twice divorced in spirit, if not yet on paper. Howard Hawks was one of the most powerful filmmakers in America, the man behind Scarface, and would soon make Bringing Up Baby and His Girl Friday. He was also, at that exact moment, still married to Athol Shearer, sister of the far more famous Norma Shearer. That inconvenient detail did not slow Hawks down for 1 second. He pursued Slim relentlessly. He proposed to her, by most accounts, in the middle of an air race. Think about that. Not a quiet dinner, not a walk on a beach. A cross-country air race, engines screaming, and Howard Hawks decided that was the moment. It tells you almost everything about how he operated, and it tells you something about Slim too, because she said yes. 3 years passed between that proposal and the wedding, while Hawks worked through the divorce from Athol Shearer. Hollywood in those years ran on exactly this kind of arithmetic. Marriages ending quietly so new ones could begin loudly. Everyone involved still expected to show up smiling at the same parties the following weekend. Slim learned the choreography of that world fast, and she never seemed uncomfortable in it, at least not on the surface. They married on December 11th, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, in a country that had just been dragged into a world war and had no idea yet what it would cost. Slim was 25. She was now, on paper, one of the most enviable wives in Hollywood. The director's wife, the woman with the eye. And she did have an eye, a genuinely rare one. It wasn't long before she was shaping the look of Hawks's films from the sidelines, suggesting faces, suggesting talent, suggesting exactly the kind of woman audiences would fall for. Their life together split neatly between two poles: Los Angeles for the working months, Palm Springs for the winters, the same social loop of dinners and tennis and long, boozy weekends with people like Gary Cooper drifting in and out. From the outside, it looked effortless. Slim had married one of the town's most respected directors, and she seemed to fit into his world like she'd been born to it, rather than dropped into it from a modeling job 3 years earlier. In 1943, she saw a Harper's Bazaar cover of a 19-year-old model with sleepy eyes and a low, smoky voice nobody had heard yet. Her name was Betty Bacall. Slim told Howard he needed to see her. He did. He flew her to Hollywood, cast her in To Have and Have Not, and the character she played was named Slim, written and dressed in the image of the woman who found her. Picture that for a second. A director casts a 19-year-old newcomer to play a character modeled on his own wife, dresses her in his wife's style, gives her his wife's nickname, and the wife herself is the one who found the girl in the first place. It is a strange, layered arrangement even by Hollywood standards, and it worked. That 19-year-old became Lauren Bacall, one of the defining stars of the era, and Slim Keith discovered her from a magazine rack. She should have been at the absolute peak of her power. She had married one of the most important directors in the industry. She had an instinct for talent that turned into a legend on its own. She had a daughter, Kitty, born in 1946. And underneath all of it, her marriage was already rotting. Howard Hawks could not stop cheating. Not occasionally, consistently, and without much effort to hide it. The man who had chased her through an air race to propose could not manage the far simpler task of staying faithful to her once he had her. It's a pattern you'll see again and again in this story, and it starts here, with the very first husband. Slim did something that a lot of women in her position, in that decade, in that world, simply did not do. She left, not quietly, not to sulk in a guest house while the marriage limped along for appearances. She got on a plane to Havana, to stay with her friend Ernest Hemingway, who was living there with his current wife, Mary. Her friendship with Hemingway predated all of this. He had pursued her romantically years earlier, back in her single days, and she'd turned him down, which is a fairly remarkable thing to be able to say about yourself in hindsight. What survived that rejection was a real friendship, the kind that let her show up in Havana in the middle of a collapsing marriage and simply be absorbed into his household without a single awkward question asked. Hawks, notably, had also spent years chasing the film rights to Hemingway's work, which meant Slim's marriage and her friendship with the writer had been tangled together from the start, in ways that made her eventual escape to his house feel almost inevitable. And it was in Havana, away from her husband, surrounded by writers and drinkers and a completely different kind of glamour than Hollywood offered, that Slim Keith met the man she would later call the love of her life. His name was Leland Hayward. He was one of the most powerful agents and producers on Broadway and in Hollywood, the kind of man who could get any script read and any deal made. He was also, at that exact moment, married to actress Margaret Sullivan. Slim was still married to Hawks. Neither of those facts stopped what happened next. They fell for each other in Cuba, of all places, two people already married to other people, drawn together in a country neither of them belonged to. It took time to unwind both marriages. Hawks and Slim divorced in 1949. Sullivan and Hayward untangled their own union around the same window, and Slim and Leland married in 1949 at the Long Island home of their close friends, the Paleys, the same Paleys whose name will matter enormously later in this story. This marriage is the one Slim would spend the rest of her life describing as the real thing, not the one that made her a Hollywood wife, not the one that would eventually make her a titled British lady, the one in the middle. She said it plainly, decades later, in words that stayed with everyone who read them. When she lost Leland, she lost the best part of her life. For a while, it looked like the marriage that would last. They moved to New York. Leland's career kept climbing. He would go on to produce South Pacific and Gypsy, cornerstones of American theater that are still being staged today, decades after he put them together. He was, by every account, one of the sharpest deal-makers on Broadway, a man who could get financing for a show simply by walking into the right restaurant at the right hour. Slim was at his side for the biggest years of that career, present at opening nights, present at the parties that followed, part of the machinery that got those shows onto a stage in the first place. Slim, meanwhile, became something close to a fashion institution. She made the best-dressed list almost every single year. In 1946, while still married to Hayward, she won a Neiman Marcus Fashion Award. People called her the original California girl, for the golden, athletic, unbothered look that no stylist could manufacture, and every stylist tried to copy. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because Slim was not simply the wounded party sitting home while her husband strayed. During her marriage to Hayward, she had a one-night encounter with Frank Sinatra, at the height of his fame and his own reputation for chaos. It's a small detail in the wider arc of her life, but it matters, because it means the marriage she would spend the rest of her life romanticizing was already showing cracks well before it actually ended. Later, and more seriously, she had a longer affair with the writer Peter Viertel, a man with his own deep ties to Hollywood and to the Hemingway circle she'd grown close to in Havana. This wasn't a one-night lapse. It ran long enough and mattered enough that biographers treat it as a genuine strain on the marriage, not a footnote. The marriage that she called the love of her life was not a fairy tale. It was two ambitious, restless people, both capable of straying, trying to hold something together in a world that gave them every opportunity not to. It held for 12 years, then it didn't. In 1959, Hayward began seeing Pamela Churchill, the former wife of Randolph Churchill, a woman with her own formidable reputation for attaching herself to powerful men. Hayward and Slim divorced in 1960. On the very same day his divorce from Slim became final, in Carson City, Nevada, Leland Hayward married Pamela Churchill, not weeks later, not months later, the same day. Sit with that for a second. The man Slim Keith called the love of her life divorced her and remarried another woman on the exact same afternoon. There was no gap, no decent interval, no pretense that this had crept up on anyone. It had clearly been planned, arranged, and executed with the kind of cold precision that must have felt like a second betrayal layered directly on top of the first. She had left one husband for him. He left her the moment someone more useful came along. This is the point in the story where a weaker person disappears from public life. Slim Keith did not disappear. She rebuilt, again, the way she had after Hawks, and in 1962 she married a British banker and aristocrat, Kenneth Keith, later Baron Keith of Castleacre. This marriage moved her out of the Hollywood-Broadway axis entirely and into British high society, complete with a title. Lady Keith of Castleacre. The California girl who'd never finished school properly was now genuine British aristocracy, mixing with a completely different set of names in a completely different country, in her mid-40s, starting over yet again. It was, on paper, the grandest match of the three. A title outlasts a film career and outlasts a Broadway hit. But grandeur on paper rarely tells you anything about what a marriage actually feels like from the inside. And this one wore down the same way the others had, just more slowly and more quietly, without a same-day remarriage to punctuate the ending. It did not end any better than the first two. She and Kenneth Keith separated in 1972, after roughly a decade together, and the marriage that gave her the title she'd carry for the rest of her life ended the way the previous two had, with Slim on her own again, older, and no closer to the lasting partnership she'd spent 3 tries chasing. 3 marriages. 3 powerful men, each one more prestigious on paper than the last. A legendary film director, a legendary theatrical producer, a genuine baron. 3 endings that left her exactly where she started, alone, brilliant, glamorous, and, underneath the best-dressed lists and the parties and the title, quietly accumulating the kind of losses that don't show up in a photograph. Her daughter Kitty, born during the Hawks marriage, grew up mostly at a distance from her father, who by every account showed little interest in raising her. Slim carried most of that weight herself, across 3 marriages and 3 households, moving her daughter from Los Angeles to New York to, eventually, a life that touched British society as well. Kitty Hawks would go on to build her own career as an interior designer, largely out of the spotlight her mother had lived under for decades, which may have been exactly the point. And through all 3 marriages, There was one relationship that mattered more than any of them, at least for a while. Her friendship with Truman Capote. They met through the world Slim moved in, and Capote adored her instantly. Sharp-tongued, unbothered by convention, funny in a way that could cut you open before you noticed the blade. Slim was exactly the kind of woman Capote collected as friends. He called her and a small circle of similarly glamorous, similarly wealthy women his swans. Babe Paley, Lee Radziwill, CZ Guest, Gloria Guinness, Morella Agnelli. Slim was arguably his favorite. An entire chapter of her later memoir is devoted to just how close they were, during her marriage to Hayward, and long after it ended. For years, Capote was the person these women told everything to. Affairs, humiliations, the private failures behind the public elegance. He was small, strange, brilliant, and utterly non-threatening to their husbands, which made him the safest confidant imaginable. He listened, he remembered, and apparently, he was taking notes the entire time. Understand what he actually got out of this friendship, because it wasn't just companionship. Capote was, by his own admission, a tourist in this world. He hadn't been born into money or society, and he knew it, and the women around him mostly knew it too. But he was brilliant enough and entertaining enough that they let him pass the velvet rope anyway and treated him almost like a mascot. He repaid that access by becoming genuinely devoted to them, at least for a while. He and Slim spoke constantly. He knew about the Sinatra encounter. He knew about Peter Viertel. He almost certainly knew things about her marriages that even her own children didn't know. That kind of access is exactly what made answered prayers possible in the first place, and exactly what made the betrayal, when it finally arrived, feel so much worse than an ordinary falling out between friends. That brings us back to the phone call that opened this video. By 1975, Capote had spent years working, in fits and starts, on a novel he believed would be his masterpiece. He called Answered Prayers his answer to Proust. It was never finished and was published only after his death, but a single chapter of it ran in Esquire that November, under the title La Côte Basque, 1965, named for the New York restaurant where Capote's fictional narrator holds court over lunch, dissecting the secrets of the women around her. The characters had different names. Nobody who knew these women was fooled for 1 second. Slim herself became the model for a character named Lady Ina Coolberth, the narrator gossiping her way through everyone else's ruined marriages and hidden affairs. Babe Paley recognized a story about her own husband's infidelity, dressed up just thinly enough to be deniable and just clearly enough to be unmistakable. It was, functionally, 20 years of private confession sold to the public under a coat of fictional paint. One woman in that circle, Anne Woodward, had shot and killed her husband years earlier, under circumstances that were never fully resolved. Capote's version of that story ran in the same excerpt. Woodward took her own life days before the piece was published, having apparently seen an advance copy. Read that again. A woman killed herself because of what Capote was about to publish about her, before the rest of the world had even seen it. When the issue hit newsstands, the reaction from Slim and the others was not restrained. Babe Paley never spoke to Capote again for the rest of her life. She died of lung cancer a few years later, having cut him out completely. Slim, who had loved this strange little man as a genuine friend for 2 decades, was just as finished with him. The women who had trusted Capote with everything closed ranks and shut him out entirely. Capote had bet that his talent and his charm would carry him through the fallout. He was catastrophically wrong. He became a social pariah almost overnight, cut off from the exact world that had made his writing possible, and he spent the rest of his life sliding further into addiction, unable to finish the novel he'd destroyed his own friendships to write. He never really recovered. Only one woman in his old circle stuck by him afterward, and tellingly, she wasn't one of the swans he had betrayed. Joanne Carson, the ex-wife of talk show host Johnny Carson, remained close to Capote until his death in 1984, nearly a decade after the Esquire piece ran. Everyone else, everyone he had actually spent 20 years courting and confiding with, was gone. Slim among them, for good. For Slim, the betrayal confirmed something she probably already suspected about her entire adult life. The men she trusted most, the ones she let closest, kept finding ways to use that closeness against her. A director who couldn't stay faithful, a love of her life who left her for someone more advantageous the moment the opportunity appeared, and now a friend, not a husband this time, who turned 20 years of private trust into a public spectacle for the sake of a novel. That is the story sitting underneath the glamour. 3 marriages, a title, a place on every best-dressed list for a decade. Credit for discovering one of the most iconic actresses in American film history. And behind every single one of those accomplishments, a betrayal that arrived right when she'd finally started to feel secure. If you're finding this as fascinating as we do, tap subscribe now, because we cover a new story like this every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. In her later years, Slim did something that a lot of the women in her circle never dared to do. She wrote it all down herself. In the late 1980s, after her marriage to Kenneth Keith had ended, and after decades of being talked about, gossiped over, and eventually fictionalized by Capote, she sat for a long series of taped interviews with writer Ernest Hemingway. The result was published as an oral history memoir, structured entirely in her own voice, titled Slim, Memories of a Rich and Imperfect Life. She called it therapeutic. After 3 marriages that each ended in a version of the same wound, after watching her closest friend turn her secrets into entertainment for strangers, she wanted the last word to actually be hers. The memoir went through her marriage to Hawks, her deep friendship with Hemingway, the discovery of Lauren Bacall, the years with Hayward that she still considered the truest love of her life, and the slow unraveling of that final British marriage. She didn't sand down the imperfect parts. The subtitle told you that up front. Working with Tappert meant the book came together as spoken memory rather than polished prose, which gives it a different texture than most Hollywood memoirs of the period. You get contradictions left standing, rather than smoothed over. You get her still defending Hayward decades after he left her for Pamela Churchill, on the very day his divorce was final, still calling him the love of her life despite everything that happened between them. Grief doesn't always resolve into a tidy verdict, and Slim, to her credit, didn't force one onto the page just because the book needed a clean ending. By the time those tapes were recorded, decades had passed since the Esquire betrayal, and Capote himself had been dead for several years, having died in 1984 without ever repairing the friendships he'd burned. Slim had outlived the man who wronged her, outlived 2 of her 3 marriages in every sense but the legal record, and was finally sitting down to describe her own life in her own words, on her own schedule, answerable to nobody's magazine deadline but her own. She completed the manuscript shortly before she died. Slim Keith passed away in New York in April 1990, at 72. The book was published by Simon & Schuster that July, 3 months after her death. So the woman who spent her whole life being described by other people, by Hollywood, by the gossip pages, by Truman Capote in a magazine article that ended a friendship, finally got to describe herself, on her own terms, and the world only got to read it after she was already gone. It's worth sitting with what actually made her so envied, because it wasn't the marriages themselves. Plenty of women married powerful men in that era and are completely forgotten now. What made Slim Keith different was that she was never defined by any single one of those men. She discovered Lauren Bacall on her own initiative, not because a director told her to. She built a reputation for taste and instinct that outlasted every marriage. She kept the friendship of people like Hemingway, independent of whichever husband she happened to have at the time. Even her nickname was hers before any of the men arrived, and it was still hers after every one of them left. The envy other women felt watching her wasn't really about the husbands. It was about the fact that she seemed, from the outside, entirely herself no matter which name she was using that decade. Hawks, Hayward, Keith. 3 surnames, 1 woman underneath all of them who never fully disappeared into any of the roles. Compare that to some of the other women in her circle. Babe Paley was, in many ways, defined almost entirely by her marriage to Bill Paley, the CBS chief whose infidelities she endured for decades in exchange for a certain kind of untouchable social standing. When Capote exposed that marriage, he took something from Babe that she didn't have a separate identity to fall back on. Slim had built enough of a reputation, enough of an eye, enough of a name that was hers before any husband arrived, that even 3 failed marriages and 1 devastating betrayal couldn't take the whole of her away. That distinction is subtle, and it is probably the single biggest reason her story still gets told, while so many of her contemporaries have faded into footnotes. And yet, look at what it actually cost her. A first husband who couldn't stop cheating almost from the day they married. A second husband, the one she genuinely loved, who left her for a more strategically valuable woman and didn't even wait a day to remarry. A third marriage that gave her a title and ended anyway. A best friend who spent 20 years collecting her secrets and then sold them for the sake of his own literary ambition. 3 marriages, 1 friendship. Every single one of them ended in some form of betrayal. That is the part the magazine covers and the best-dressed lists never showed you. And it's the part that makes her story worth telling now, 50 years after that phone call from Babe Paley, 60 years after 2 divorces finalized on the same afternoon, 80 years after a 19-year-old model became a movie star because Slim happened to notice a magazine cover. She was Hollywood's most envied wife. She was also, underneath that, a woman who kept losing the people she trusted the most, and who kept getting back up anyway, 3 times over, until she finally sat down and told the story herself. It's worth asking why a story from the 1940s through the 1980s still holds an audience today, decades after every one of its main characters has died. Part of it is simple curiosity about a vanished world, one where a director could propose mid-air race and a socialite's magazine cover could launch a movie star. But most of it, probably, is recognition. Everyone knows what it feels like to trust the wrong person, to be left for someone deemed more useful, to keep rebuilding after a loss that was supposed to be the last one. Slim Keith just happened to live that pattern in front of the entire country, 3 marriages, and 1 devastating friendship at a time, dressed the whole way through in clothes good enough to make the best-dressed list. That combination, glamour on the surface and genuine wreckage underneath, is the reason her name resurfaced decades later in a hit television series, and it's the reason her own memoir still gets passed around and recommended today, long after the magazines that once covered her have folded or moved on to newer names entirely. If this kind of story pulls you in, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're covering more of Hollywood's most complicated women very soon. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.